there was a few things I just wanted to chat through with you this evening. I don't want this to be a lecture. I thought we might talk about materials, what kind of materials you need. And I thought, so thinking about types of yarn, colours, what colours work and what colours don't, the gauge and the size, which are pretty straightforward as it's a headband, and just how different yarns might affect the softness and the stitch definition and that kind of thing. I wanted to also show you how I do the long tail provisional cast on, which is the first move that you have to make on the pattern. There are lots of different ways that are shown to do this on the internet, and some of them are really complicated, far more complicated than they need to be. Although if you were a crocheter, you might disagree with me, but I'm going to show you how to do them with just the yarn and the needles, which I think is much simpler, and a way that I do it as well, which is a little bit of a, not a cheat, but it saves a bit of time later when you're picking up your stitches again. So the pattern, which I have in a stroke of genius left in the office, so who has a pattern in front of them? Correct me if my memory fails me, but the pattern tells you will need 10 to 15 grams, I think, of the two colors that you're going to use for the outer, for the ferrule bit of the headband. Hang on. You've got your yarn for your outer, obviously an orange and a blue in this case. And then you've got a yarn for your inner. In this case, it's just a plain blue one. And the yarn that you need is 4-ply weight. So when we say 4-ply, that is referring to the weight of the yarn and the number of times it wraps around a ruler in an inch. So it doesn't necessarily mean that there are 4 strands plied together, confusingly. It just relates to the weight of the yarn. So for example, the yarn that I use, which is the yarn that I normally use is this Shetland Spindrift by Jameson's, and this is a 4-ply weight yarn, but there are only 2 plies in it, and you can see that if you sort of untwist it, you can see quite clearly that there are only 2 strands plied together and not 4, but it's a 4-ply weight. So that's what you're looking for, and you can usually tell by the gauge as well. So the gauge in the pattern is pretty much, I think it's exactly the same gauge as the Jameson's wool. So it's 32 rows and 30 stitches to a 10 centimeter square. Now, this is a headband. It's not a sophisticated garment it's not even a large garment. So any kind of slight difference in your gauge isn't going to make a massive amount of difference. And I think the main thing when you're choosing your yarn is, you know, don't stray too far away from the gauge on the ball that you're purchasing. Make sure it's kind of similar to the one in the pattern. And don't mix your yarns, I would say. So try to use the same type for the 2 colors in the outer, and try to use a yarn of the same gauge for the inner. For the inner, I've been experimenting with a few different ones. I don't know if any of you have found something really good. I used to use a really lovely wool called it's called Mini Mochi by Crystal Palace Yarns, and they do plain colors, but they also do all these beautiful variegated colors as well. And it's just, they don't make it anymore. And I trawled the internet, and I think I bought up just about every remaining ball that was out there. So I still have a few stashed away at home, which I kind of take out and stroke, but I can't get it anymore. So I have been experimenting with different ones. And ones that I have found, if I could just find the labels on the desk here. So I tried this, John Lewis have a few, and of course they deliver, which is handy when you live up here. So there's a Merino 4-ply, which is just their own range. And that's the one that I used for the inside of this, and it is beautifully soft and nice to knit with, but it's a little bit fluffy, and it does kind of look like it might pill a bit, although I haven't worn this, so I don't know. The other one that I've been using is, there's actually a John Lewis baby merino as well, which is very nice. And this Sirdar Snuggly 100% merino. So merino, I think most people can tolerate merino against their skin. It's really smooth, and yeah, it doesn't itch. I've got some nice 4-ply weight alpaca wool as well that I bought in Norway, which I think would also be really nice, but I haven't tried it yet. And alpaca is just a little bit more hairy, so I'd be slightly concerned that the alpaca might itch a bit more, but as I said, I haven't just quite tried it yet. Other 4-ply yarns that you might try, you get this cash merino now, so it's merino mixed with cashmere. If you are feeling flush, you might want to try the cash merino, or even a cashmere. A 4-ply cashmere would be very luxurious. Bamboo is itch free, but bamboo doesn't stretch in the same way that wool does. And I think I would be a bit cautious about using something that is so different just in terms of its give, because you might end up with a difference in size and certainly a difference in stretch between your lining and your outer. So although it might be good from the point of view of not itching, I'm not sure I would recommend it, but something maybe I'll experiment with in the future. I started knitting last week. Now look, this is this lovely mini machi wool knitted up as the lining. And there's these two colors together in it, the pink and a sort of autumny greeny yellow color, which I thought I had found perfect matches for in the Jameson Spindrift. So this one's called Autumn, and I think the pink one is Lipstick. But when I put them together, not only do they not look nice, but there's so little contrast between the two of them that you can barely see the Gairloch pattern. So that is a lesson in testing your colors, either swatching before you start or using something like this program I'm going to show you to see whether you've made a good color choice or not. So this one's getting ripped out in the near future, and I thought I might go for maybe there's a purple in here somewhere too, a sort of indigo color. I thought I might go for the indigo and the pink instead. I think that's a better contrast. A very simple test that you're told to do to see whether there's sufficient contrast in your wool is just to twist two of the strands together. And if you can see the two colors quite distinctly, then there should be a reasonable contrast between them. You can sort of here, but not particularly well, I must admit. And what you can also do is just take your phone and take a black and white photograph of them. Because sometimes, even though a color it looks light, like yellow, for example, there are some shades of yellow that look bright, but are actually quite dark tones. So if you photograph them in black and white, you get a better idea of how that's going to contrast with the other color. And that can be quite telling. So wanting to show you something that I use for picking my colors and for doing my charts. Beth, you're maybe already using this if you're knitting Fair Isle charts. So hopefully you can still hear me there. Thumbs up.
Yep.
Great.
Yes.
So this is a program called chartminder.com. Has anybody used this?
No, never.
No.
Well, it's free. I happen to have a pro subscription. So you can see just there, it says pro. But even the pro subscription only costs £15 a year, something like that. So it's about £1 a month. And it gives you additional features that you don't get in the free one. But if you're just making charts for your own purposes, you could probably quite happily use the free version. I think there might be a watermark on your chart or something like that, that probably wouldn't upset you too much. So I've got heaps of charts in here. I've got some Fair Isle ones that I've been knitting, and some I just put in here to keep, and some I'm trying out colors. So these ones are actually weaving ones. I was doing some crock bragged weaving, and I've done the charts for those in there too. You can save them. And this is one here, which is from a Gairloch Pattern headband. It was one of the first ones I knitted. It was for my sister, and she wanted it in a green and white.
That is really strange because that's what I'm knitting just now. Because
is that right?
The guy that I'm knitting it
Celtic
for,
colours.
he's a Hib supporter, so he wants it in green and white.
Well, my sister's obviously Irish, but she lives in America, so maybe there's a connection there, Beth.
Yeah, there is actually, yeah.
So you can see down here, there's two really useful features in this, just in this very simple, without even talking about the chart construction. So once you've made the chart, you can change your colors. So I can go back into this chart at any time and I can try out different colors. So by just clicking on that, so my sister, for example, likes pink and yellow. So I could change that to pink, and I could change the white one to yellow, and you get, you can make this as advanced as you like. You can drag through all different shades of the colors. It's the hex number. So there's a 6-digit or 6-figure, 6-character code for every single color. There are thousands of them. And if you just Google that, if you Google color hex codes on the internet, you'll find it just on Wikipedia. If you're using a Windows computer, it will allow you to select a hex code. And I actually have a list which I've made for myself. This is sort of knitting geekery that I get up to in my spare time. But I have a long list where I have matched up the Jameson's colors against these hex codes for the internet, so that I can just refer to that and I can stick it in for my chart and I can see how two colors look together. Yeah, so you can use Chartminder to kind of trial what your pattern might look like just with two colors. Some of the ones that we have in the museum have got lovely kind of muted green and blue colors. And even though the contrast isn't actually that great between them, they still look really nice. So it is worth trying. And if you're knitting for somebody who's wanting, if you were knitting the Gairloch stockings, for example, knitting for somebody who's wanting to wear them with a kilt, you might be looking for something a bit more muted because you don't want it to be clashing with the kilt. So that is my tip for working out your colors, or my tips for working out your colors. And my next two colors, I haven't tried them in Chartminder yet. but I'm planning to use, can you see these okay? This is a kind of a nice, I've got just a plain, I'm going to use this plain lining, and this shade is called Spice. It's a beautiful color, kind of a, it's almost like madder, only like a faded madder. It's really nice. I was going to do that with the blue because the blue's actually got a little bit of a fleck of that color in it. So we'll see how that one turns out. Right. So if I go back to, I'm not going to save those. So if I create a new chart, it'll ask me questions. I can generate it from an image. So I can scan in an image, give it a name, tell them how wide I want it. So the Gairloch pattern is, I think, 22 wide and 31 high. And am I knitting it in the round or in the flat, etc., etc. Symbols is for cable knitting. If you're a cable knitter, you might want to use symbols instead of colors, or you might want to use both. If you're doing something like mosaic knitting, maybe. And if you are a pro member, you can choose whether your chart would be private or public. And so if I create that, then it just gives me my blank chart, and I can add colors. So I can have as many colors as I like, and then I just create my chart in there just by clicking on the squares. It's so simple and so useful and so free. And one thing I forgot to show you, and I'll just go back and show you it now, is that you can actually use it. I don't know about everyone else, but I use one of these magnetic boards with a little ruler just to mark where I am on my chart. I don't always need it, but it is quite useful if you have a bad memory like me.
Never seen that before.
Yeah, I can't remember where I got it. I think I probably sent away for it online. But if you use Chartminder, what's happening? Oh, sorry. You can actually go into knitting mode. So it highlights the row that you're on, and you can click the next row button and it moves you up it.
Oh, that'd be so useful.
It is really useful. So that dispenses with the magnetic board as well. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's actually a magnet. Well, it's actually quite difficult if you're having to have a computer open.
Use my iPad. You can use Chartminder on your iPad. So I could quite happily sit with the chart up on my iPad and just kind of spool up the rows as I do it until I run out of battery. And that's when I go back to the magnetic board. Yeah. Well, let's have a go at this provisional cast on then. Right, you should be able to see my knitting now, or my hands.
Yeah.
Great. I'll just move over so I'm underneath the camera. Can you still see my face?
No, on the right hand side, yeah.
You can. Okay, that's good. Now, I'm gonna show you this a few times with different needles. And bear with me. So we're casting on with our lining yarn. I'm actually using a thicker one just so you can see it better. So this is Aran weight merino. And as I said to Beth earlier, if you think that it's going to take you a while to get used to this method, then just try it with Aran weight and get the hang of it before you start with a 4-ply. I'm also using some waste yarn. So you need a piece of waste yarn. I quite often don't even disengage it from the ball, so it doesn't have to be waste yarn. It's just a contrasting color here. Now I put both my balls to my left Right, that's much better. So you can see me on the whole screen now, right?
Right.
So I've got my wool over on my left-hand side, and I am taking my waste yarn and my lining yarn, and I'm just going to put a knot in the end to tie the two of them together. Just a simple knot, doesn't matter what kind of knot. Now, you could cut your waste yarn just so it's not on the ball. And if you do want to cut it, make things a bit easier for yourself, make sure you leave, I'd say at least twice the length that you think you might need for the stitches, just so that you don't run out, which would always be annoying. So this is called a long tail provisional cast on. Now I'm going to show you it first on a straight needle, just because I think it's easier to see. And then I will show you it in the same way, but with a cable needle, a circular needle, rather, not a cable needle. Circular needle and cable. So I've got my lining yarn at the front. I don't know if any of you are used to doing a long tail cast on where you hold the yarn in a sort of slingshot way. So you're holding your two strands of yarn in a V. Let's call that a V. And your lining yarn is in the front. And you're going to do a movement, which when I show you it, it's going to look a bit complicated, but believe me, when you get the hang of it, it is extremely simple. It's really intuitive. And all you are basically doing is winding the wool around your needle. So I'm going in down through the V and under the lining yarn. Then I'm taking the needle all the way over the back around the two strands of yarn, and then I'm taking it back through the V. And that has left me with 2 stitches on my needle. Can you see that? 1, 2, 1, 2. So I do that again, down through the V, all the way round and back up through the V. And now I have got 4 stitches on my needle. And when I finish each move, I've always got my lining yarn at the front and my waste yarn is over the top. You can see there, it's over the top of the lining yarn. So down and forward, all the way around and back up through the V. Are you practicing? I can't actually see anyone's face. That's the problem when you're sharing screen.
So you're
So I'll
making
just do this a few times.
You're making figure 8.
Yes, I suppose it is like a figure 8. So if you just need to remember to go down and forward first and then back the other way.
That's exactly the method I saw on YouTube that I was the most successful with.
Good. Well, I can tell you it's the most successful for me as well.
But the most...
But what you really do have to remember though is that you need to keep tension on your yarn here. So you haven't created any knots there in the way that you normally would when you're making a stitch. Your stitch would be knotted onto the needle. So if I let that go, that's just all gonna wind off again. It just unravels because it's just wound around the needle. That's all.
Could you do it a few more times, Karen? Please?
Yes, of course.
I don't have a needle and I'm not a knitter, but I'll watch you.
So that should be over the top there. So I've got my lining yarn in the front of the V and the waste yarn at the back, and I'm going down through the V and I'm going out the front all the way around and out the back. Down and out the front all the way around and out the back. and always keeping tension with your left hand. And of course, every so often, you need to stop and move your stitches a bit up the needle.
Thank you.
Now, I'll show you this again with another needle. So I'm going to show you what to do when you have all your number of stitches. I am not going to cast on the full 132 for the pattern, but when you have enough, and you're always casting on 2 at a time, remember. So when you're counting your stitches, remember to count in twos, 2, 4, 6.
Oh.
So you need to take this lining yarn that's at the front, and you need to take it one more time over this waste yarn just to kind of secure it. And then in order to get yourself a secure row of stitches, you need to knit back along this. So I've taken the yarn, just twisted it round that one, and now I'm going to knit back along these stitches. So that's me into the first one. I could cut this off now, this waste yarn. I don't need the rest of it. And I'm going to knit all the way back along here. Beth, did you try to cast on with a circular needle or with a
Yeah, I
straight
tried
needle?
with a circular needle, and that's what I found very difficult, Karen, because the circular needle is quite thin. And when I tried, it just was so tight, and I don't know whether there was a way, maybe I shouldn't have, pulling it through, pulling the needle through, I maybe made it too tight, but I couldn't.
Yeah, maybe because you do need to keep tension on it. And I think when you're doing something new, the tendency is always to sort of to be a bit tense anyway. But what you could perhaps try is casting onto a straight needle, see if that's any easier. And then you can just knit if you have a double-ended one like that. So Beth, you could just, transfer them onto your circular needle once you've done them, or you could just knit them onto your circular needle. So that's me. Now I've knitted along that row that I cast on, and you can see quite clearly that I've got my normal stitches that are going to knit up this way and become my lining on the needle. And below the needle, I've got another row of stitches which are being held by this green yarn, and which I can at any time pick up and knit in the other direction. So I've got one that I was just knitting when we started meeting. I was knitting this one up. I'll just cut the ends there. So that's one just that I knitted earlier. Same thing. You can see the I've knitted up on the normal stitches there, but I've still got these provisional stitches at the end. So I can just take my my needle here and pick up the first one from either end. It doesn't matter. I'm going for this end because the other end's got a knot in it. And I just pick my stitches up. I think there's the next one. It's probably easier to do this with a smaller needle. But you just need to thread your other needle through. I got a smaller needle. Not handy, no. But I'm sure you get the idea. Yeah. So you thread those stitches back on, and then you can just pull your waste yarn out. You don't need it anymore. It was just there to hold them. So I could now knit those stitches back in the other direction.
Very clever.
It is.
I'd never seen that before. Never. It's very good.
Now, I said I would show you this on different needles because I'm going to show you a tip that I use. So instead of using waste yarn, I'm going to cast them onto a circular needle rather than a straight one this time. So this is my circular needle that I'm going to knit with, my 40 centimeter one. But I'm also going to use, instead of my waste yarn, I'm going to use a longer circular needle. And it doesn't have to be the same dimensions as this one. So it doesn't have to be, for the pattern, the specified length is, the specified size of needle is 3.25 millimeters. So you're wanting your smaller circular to be 3.25, but it doesn't matter what dimension your second one is, your longer one, because all that it is doing is standing in for your waste yarn. So I don't need my waste yarn anymore. This is my waste yarn. And instead of, trap that between my knees, instead of tying a knot, the two pieces of yarn together, you remember that was the first thing I did last time, I'm going to just do a little knot like this, and I'm going to put it over my circular needle, my longer one, and I'm just going to leave that on there like that. So remember last time I had my two bits of yarn off to my left. So now I've got my circular needle and my lining yarn. Circular needle, the purple one, is in place of the waste yarn. So I take my knitting needle and I'm just going to do exactly the same moves. I'm going to go under and round and back up through. This cable needle, I don't think maybe I've ever used, or I keep calling it a cable needle. This circular needle probably hasn't been used before, so it's quite twisty. But just the same idea. You can see the stitches going on to my needle. And when I get the required number of stitches, I actually find it much easier with the circular needle because it's stiffer than the waste yarn and you don't need to put nearly as much tension on it because it's quite firm itself, and it does just kind of sit there between your fingers. You're not always having to tension it. So you can see I can actually go much quicker with it.
Does it not make it harder then to carry on knitting when you've got these needles hanging off?
That is the downside, yes. It does make it a little more difficult because you have them hanging down. Yeah. But I really only notice that for the first couple of rows. And once I've knitted up a bit, I can forget about it, especially if it's a longer cable needle. You know, it's not really in your way. I tell you when it does get in the way, when the cat wants to sit in my lap and all of a sudden the needles are dangling on the cat and the cat's getting irritated. So it's worse for the cat than it is for me. But you can see because this cable is nice and firm, you actually get a really beautiful, neat finish with that.
That's good, yeah.
Much better than you do with the waste yarn. And of course, the other great benefit to this is that when you come to need your provisional stitches again, when you have to pick those up, you're not picking them off a piece of yarn. In fact, you don't need to pick them up at all because they're already on a needle. That needle is already in there. So all you have to do is turn your work upside down and start knitting on the second pair of needles, or on the second circular needle rather. So I've got my, it's a bit difficult to show this because the screen isn't big enough, but I've got my second circular needle coming out the bottom here, and move these onto the cable, and my first circular needle coming out the top. So I can knit either direction there. It's a bit like Siamese twins. And the other thing that I sometimes do instead of the longer circular needle is, if you have these sets of interchangeable needles, where you get, you get the cable and you get the needles separately, and they kind of screw on, and then you can change what sizes you're using. You get these nifty little things that go on the end to stop your needle, stop your wool falling off your needles, or your stitches falling off your needles. So this is actually what I most often use. I will do my provisional cast on using the normal needle and using this cable with the dead ends as my waste yarn. And then when it comes to picking up the provisional stitches to use them, all I need to do is unscrew these little ends, and I can then screw a needle onto the end of that. And then I don't, as Beth said, I don't have these needles hanging in my lap the whole time when I'm knitting. All I have is these little end pieces. So that's what works for me. And if you have these interchangeable needles, that is what I would recommend. Now, if you're using a second circular needle, or if you're using this system here, the size of needle that you use, it doesn't matter. I think I mentioned this before, because you're not actually ever knitting with these needles. All you're doing is, when you get to the point where you've knitted your lining, you start your lining here and you knit it that way, and then you start your outer. Forget about this blue bit along the edge, it comes later. You start your outer and you knit it that way, and then you knit the two together. Oh, my phone's gone again. Then you knit the two sides together. So you'll have your lining yarn on your needles, and your you'll have this on your needles. You'll have your outer on your needles, and your provisional stitches will be here. And you won't be knitting your provisional stitches any further. All you will be doing is knitting them together with the other side. So it's not going to affect your gauge or your knitting in any way. And so actually a good tip is to use a needle which is smaller, because it's easier to slide the needles off when you're knitting the two of them together. We're going to do, I think, another couple of weeks of this. Just this has already been an hour, but we'll come back to those techniques, I think, in future weeks as well. But the message for now is, if you can get the hang of it, use the long tail provisional cast on, and try and do it either with the two circular needles if you can, and if you have them. Doesn't matter what size the other one is, just make sure it's a bit longer than this one. So this one is 40 centimeters, so you're looking for a 60 centimeter or bigger. I think this one is 80. And in an ideal scenario, if you've got the interchangeable kit, use the wee round ends instead of the ends of the needles. So I don't know if anybody's got any questions or wants to chip in any way. There are two more sort of quick things that I would like to say just before we finish, but I'll give you a chance just to ask me anything first.
Just to say that I wish my mother or my grandmother had these techniques.
I know. I mean, knitting is really, it's all kind of such a science now, you know, as well as an art. And I think that's why I'm interested in it as well, because there are always new techniques to learn. And, you know, personally, I really enjoy that. If I was always knitting the same thing, oh, I'm back. If I were always knitting the same sort of types of things, I think I would get bored with it. But because there are all, you know, people, these clever knitting designers are always thinking up these new techniques. And there's so many different ways you can cast on now. You know, if you're knitting a hat, you get these brilliant stretchy cast-ons that you can use, so that like I put a pullover on today that I knitted, and I always cast off too tight. And, you know, I need to learn to use a different technique of cast off so that I don't have to yank my pullover over my head when I've knitted it myself. And these wonderful kind of invisible cast-ons now that you can use for toe-up socks, for example, so that you've got these beautiful smooth toes. Whereas when you knitted them before, you were always casting off at the toes, and you always had that kind of knobbly, uncomfortable bit at the toe. So I think that there's always, I don't know if science is the right word, but all these great techniques are always being invented and introduced now, which, as you say, Beth, our mothers and our grandmothers didn't have, but they're incredibly useful. Yeah. Is a long tail provisional cast on, but you will, and that's the one that's mentioned in the pattern, but you will find different methods for that. But I've got a real tangle of wool and needles in front of me. This is one I cast on earlier with the finer yarn and with some waste yarn. So the red is my waste yarn. So you need to be obviously really careful when you are joining your circular knitting together that you don't put a twist in it. So use that contrast color just to check that there's no twist in your needle and that you are joining it together the right way up. And sometimes easier to knit into the back of the first stitch to do that. The other thing I would recommend, which I haven't just done, but if you mark the end of your round, if you don't have any stitch markers, just put a slip knot in a piece of wool that's a different color and put that onto your needle so that you know every time you come to that different color, that's the end of your round. So that should now be my knitting in a circle. And I've got my down, or my bottom, which is the red bit, all on the inside, and I've got my blue all on the outside. Thumbs up, that has worked. So just be really careful about that, because it is hellishly difficult in my experience to unravel that if you get it wrong. You can normally sort of fix it within the first couple of rows if you get it early enough so that you don't notice the twist. But if you leave it any longer than that, you have to rip the whole thing out. And then the second thing I was going to say was, if you are knitting with two colors, you can obviously just hold both colors in one hand. However, in order to get this effect where you've got one color standing out, so the stitches are kind of standing out in relation to the background stitches, so one color standing out more than the others, you can really only get that properly if you are knitting with one color in each hand. Now this is a bit like learning to type. When you type with one finger and you start learning to type, but it's still quicker to type with one finger, but you just have to persevere, because eventually you'll get the hang of it and it will be so much easier and better. So if you cannot already, I would recommend that you start teaching yourself to do continental knitting. So that's where you hold your yarn in your left hand. And your needle, your circular needle, but you're knitting with your right hand and you've got your yarn in your left hand. I'm not going to show you how to do that now, but we'll do that next time. We'll do the knitting with 2 colors. But if you want to have a practice in the meantime, have a look on YouTube at how to do continental knitting, because if you can do that, you'll be able to do your 1 color stitches with your right hand and 1 color stitches with your left hand, and that will make your life a whole lot easier. And it will also make your knitting more beautiful because your colors will stand out in relation to each other in the way that they're supposed to. And it does. It makes a big difference when you block them. Depends on the wool. If it's not actually wool, if it's acrylic, then it doesn't make as much of a difference. But if it is wool, pure wool or mostly wool, it will make a massive difference. And all you need to do is run some tepid water, put a little bit of shampoo in it. I sometimes even use very liquid, and soak it for about 20 minutes. And I take it out. I wring it sort of loosely. You don't want to wring it tightly because you're not supposed to, pull the fibers while the wool is wet. But what I do is lay it onto a towel, and I roll the towel up like a Swiss roll with the headband inside it, and I kind of do like a little Thai massage almost on the towel, and that kind of gets a lot of the water out. And I have head forms, just these polystyrene ones. You can get them on eBay. They're not expensive, and I dry them on those. But you could equally use a bowl that was the right size, or you could use a balloon. If you blow a balloon up to the size of your head, and just use a balloon, that would work as well.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hopefully see you next week.
Thanks very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Cheery.